Let's take a deeper dive into NATO's strategic priorities and explore the growing security cooperation between South Korea and NATO. Today, we are honored to have a distinguished guest from Belgium. She has served as NATO's deputy spokesperson and head of press and media for 12 years. She currently oversees security policies and cooperation across NATO member states. Please welcome Carmen Romero, Director of the Security Policy at NATO. Carmen, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me with you today. It is really a pleasure.
Yes, actually, earlier we discussed NATO's history and the evolution of NATO's strategic concept. NATO, once established as a regional organization focusing on European security, has expanded the scope of mission and partnership so far. So in your opinion, what is the key driving factor behind all this change?
I would like to make the point that NATO continues to be a regional organization. So NATO's main focus remains on Euro-Atlantic security. It is about protecting and keeping the 1 billion people who live in the member states in Europe and North America safe. So NATO is mainly a collective security organization. It's based on deterrence to prevent conflict and to preserve peace. At the same time, many of the security challenges that we face today have no borders. They are global, and this is why since 2010 we are also dealing with cooperative security, and we are working very closely with like-minded partners, like for example South Korea. We are working together, exchanging experiences, comparing notes on how each of us is dealing with growing emerging security challenges, and this is where our cooperation comes in. And South Korea is a very important partner of NATO, so we work together, for example, in dealing with emerging and disruptive technologies. We are also working on the responsible use of artificial intelligence in the military domain, but also our cooperation is very focused on cyber defense threats that have no borders. So we conduct exercises where also the Republic of Korea participates on cyber, and we are also working together on how to deal with hybrid threats that are very difficult to detect and that are very challenging. And this cooperation makes us stronger and also increases the individual resilience of both NATO and our partner, South Korea.
Yes, right. But indeed, actually the UN is the key organization with an authority to deal with international security and peace. But given the tension among P5, actually that almost paralyzed the UN Security Council and makes the UN less effective than before. So, in your opinion, how does NATO establish its role in this regard?
Well, NATO supports the United Nations Charter, and this is why, and of course, NATO has no intention to replace the United Nations in any way, and some of the operations or missions that NATO has conducted were with the United Nations Security Council mandate. So, for example, what NATO does to support Ukraine is to support Ukraine in the defense of its right to self-defense, which is a right that is enshrined in the United Nations Charter, and also our work with like-minded partners. For example, NATO has 35 partners across the world, partners that go from Colombia to New Zealand, and one of the common objectives is to work together because we share the same values, we share very similar security challenges, and we work together to respect and defend the international rules-based order. This is what really brings us together, and this order, international law, is also based on the principles of the United Nations. So for us, we also collaborate closely with the United Nations, so it's important to work together.
Yeah, actually, you just mentioned Ukraine, so let me ask you this. Actually, Ukraine crisis or the war in Ukraine is viewed as one of the most significant events of the 21st century, right? So I believe the NATO's strategic thinking has changed because of these events. So how do you assess the change of NATO's strategy before and after the war in Ukraine?
So NATO has 75 years, and what makes NATO a very powerful organization is the fact that as the world has changed, NATO has changed with it, and NATO has continuously adapted to deal with the new and emerging security challenges. So this is also the situation in Ukraine. So for us, from our point of view, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia started in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea, and following that, we saw a more assertive Russia. We saw Russia violating international law, and NATO conducted the most challenging, the biggest reinforcement of its collective defense since the end of the Cold War, and then with the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine by Russia, as you say, we saw that Russia really undermined international rules-based order and also the security architecture that we had built together with Russia at the end of the Cold War. So here NATO responded increasing again its deterrence and defense to prevent a conflict, not to provoke a conflict, but to prevent that the aggression against Ukraine could expand to NATO's territory. And NATO is doing since 2022 everything possible to support Ukraine in its right to self-defense. As I said, it's a right enshrined in the United Nations Charter, because this is a war of aggression. So basically one nation has been invaded by another one. And if President Putin will stop fighting, for example, today, the war would end today. But if Ukraine stops fighting today, basically Ukraine will cease to exist as a sovereign and independent country. So this is why our strategy by supporting Ukraine is to allow Ukraine to be strong on the battlefield and to be in a position when Ukraine considers that is the right moment to sit down and negotiate and achieve a fair and lasting peace. So it may seem as a paradox, but the key to concluding and bringing this war to an end is to support as much as possible Ukraine. And this is what NATO is doing. This is what NATO is doing with the support of many countries, including and partners, including with South Korea. We really appreciate what South Korea is doing to support some of the projects that NATO does in providing non-lethal support to Ukraine. For example, the Republic of Korea is very active in supporting a project related to rehabilitation of wounded soldiers in Ukraine. So every country has to do everything that is possible within its means to make sure that Putin doesn't win this war, because otherwise this would send a message to regimes, to actors, that they can use force to achieve their objectives. And one of those objectives could be to change borders. So this is why NATO and NATO allies are doing everything possible to support Ukraine, and with the aim of bringing an end to this conflict as soon as possible.
Yes, despite all those efforts that you just explained to us, well, unfortunately, it is unlikely that we are going to see an end to this crisis anytime soon. And like everybody, I love to see the end of it. So as a person coordinating security policy in NATO, do you have any creative idea to put an end to this?
To put an end to this, it's about doing everything possible to help Ukraine negotiate a fair and lasting peace. Because if you look at history, all the wars, all the conflicts end at the negotiating table. And this one will be the same. So as I was saying, the paradox is that we need to support with the provision of military assistance, security assistance and training Ukraine, so that President Putin can see that he's not going to win on the battlefield. So the more we do to support Ukraine, the shorter the war will be. So we cannot allow fatigue. We have to continue to do everything we can to basically give the means to Ukraine to win this war, because it's about our way of life, it's about our common values, our shared values, it's about defending democracy and the rule of law.
Yes, right. Since you're in Seoul, South Korea, let me ask you this question. Actually, South Korea has attended NATO summit for 3 consecutive years. So there's some expectation about growing partnership between the two sides. So in your personal opinion, why is the cooperation between South Korea and NATO so important?
This cooperation is very important because we share very similar security challenges that have no borders. So this is why it's so important that we work together in dealing with the security threats that we were discussing earlier, and it's important that we share our views on the information threats, for example, on the challenges that we have in the use of new technologies, and how we can make sure that ethics prevail. And this takes me to the responsible use of artificial intelligence in the military domain, but also cyberspace. Maritime security is so important, so we are also working on this. And actually, the cooperation between the Republic of Korea and NATO takes us to more than 2 decades. So it's not new, but it's true that we are increasing our cooperation because the challenges in the security environment keep on growing. So in 2012, for example, we had the first partnership document agreed. And the Republic of Korea was in Afghanistan, where we're working together with many other partners, and that also helped us with interoperability of our military forces. And we have been discussing, for example, the first meeting that we had of the North Atlantic Council with our Asia-Pacific partners was in 2016, and we were discussing the threats coming from North Korea and the security in the Korean peninsula. We have been condemning also North Korea missile tests, and so basically our cooperation is a cooperation of trust, long-standing, and we were very privileged to have the president of your country attending the first NATO summit in my home city, in Madrid, in 2022, and there we agreed a very ambitious partnership program. That program even grew when we met in Vilnius in 2023, and then this year in 2024 at the Washington Summit, we had also the privilege of having the leaders of our Asia-Pacific partners in a very important summit where we went even beyond in our cooperation, highlighting very specific projects where we can do more together to learn from each other on how to deal with very complex security challenges. And by doing that, we are talking about cross-cutting global security challenges. By doing that, we become more resilient. So individual resilience grows, but also our deterrence grows. The deterrence of NATO members and the deterrence of partners like South Korea.
So like you said, NATO as a whole actually prefers to strengthen ties with Indo-Pacific 4, right? Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. But however, I'm just wondering if there's any slightest difference among NATO member states in terms of their interest or practical interactions or exchanges?
What I can tell you is that NATO is a very unique organization, and NATO is the only organization where Europe and North America get together every day around the same table to discuss security challenges that have an impact on basically the security of their citizens. And everything is decided by consensus. So basically 32 allies, because as you know, we have grown. Now with the arrival of Sweden and Finland, we are now 32. And every agreement is by consensus. And this is very powerful because it shows the importance of the indivisibility of security as an organization, but also when we decide to cooperate with partners, we decide this together. So despite the fact that we are 32 democracies, so there are very lively discussions in NATO, because democracies, they are different from each other. So we have lively discussions, we disagree on certain things, but then we always end up agreeing on what is important for our collective security. And this is what makes NATO a very important organization. I also think that for our partners like the Republic of Korea, but all the partners that we have around the world, is also a privilege to sit at the table of the North Atlantic Council. Why? Because NATO represents 50% of the world's military might and 50% of the world's economy, GDP. So we are a very strong organization. We are among friends, and our partners also become friends. And what we see is that today's security challenges, we are in a very unpredictable security environment. There is not a single country that can deal with these security challenges alone. So it's very important and it's very good to have friends.
Yeah, you make me believe that this security cooperation will continue to grow in the coming years.
I can assure you that it will continue to grow.
Yes.
Beyond Ukraine, beyond is a long-standing, and it will continue to grow.
Yeah, of course. But there are some still who are questioning about the practicality of NATO-Korea cooperation because of the geographic distance between the two sides. And still there are some in South Korea arguing that South Korea needs to prioritize first our national defense, defending direct threat from North Korea. So how would you say to those who are expressing such concern?
We have to do both things. So when I spoke at the beginning about NATO, I said that the core business of our organization is the Euro-Atlantic security, is the protection of the 1 billion people who live in our member states. So the same for South Korea. So the core of our business is to protect our territories and our people. But at the same time, we will be more efficient in doing that if we work with like-minded partners, countries that can be very far away. I spoke about Colombia, I spoke about New Zealand, the Republic of Korea. They can be very far from each other, but they face very similar security challenges because they are challenges today that have no borders. So even if we are far away physically and geographically, we are very close to each other. And when we discuss with our friends from South Korea the threats that we see in the information environment, for example, dealing with disinformation propaganda, our points of view are very similar because and by comparing notes, we see that we can become stronger because we learn from each other. So actually, we are not so far from each other.
Yes, thank you for your insight, and I truly appreciate your time. And I think we should further discuss more about our cooperation so that we can elevate this relationship to the next level. So
I agree.
Yes.
I agree. Thank you.
Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.